Well, I'm not sure if we can afford stomach insurance. Right now, we're trying to put the kids through the small intestine. Now, the guy who does the far side has got a pretty decent background in biology. He knows that this is not really the way things work. His tapeworms don't live in the stomach. Too much acid in the stomach. Very few things can live and be active in that acid. And most things that live in your intestines have to have a way to get through the acid. That's why there's very few intestinal viruses, because the viruses don't generally, their casings don't do well exposed to acid. But tapeworms live in the intestines. Of course, that's where you break your food down. That's where all the nutrition is anyway. Um, but, flatworms. You needed a room with seats, I guess. Boy, these things are a cinch. God makes the snake. I mentioned that worm is a very, very common shape. It shows up in almost every phylum that you can look at. And anciently, remember, they used to classify more according to analogy than homology, and some external homology, where things look kind of the same. They kind of figured that they were related to one another, which is why, even though there are obvious passages in the Bible that refer to roundworms, our next group, they're translated as serpents because they were lumped in with the snakes. Roundworms, nematodes, or if you go far enough south, nematodes. Cylindrical, generally pointy on each end. Generally very small, although there are nematodes, soil nematodes, that get this big, kind of look like big whitish earthworms. But typically they're fairly small animals. And they are everywhere. There are almost certainly more species of nematodes than of any other animal phylum, of all the animal phylum. Not on paper. There's way more arthropods because more of those have been named. But here's the thing to consider. Virtually every species of arthropod has at least one species of roundworm parasite that just appears in that species. So that means there's at least as many roundworm species as there are arthropod species. But also roundworms are parasites in pretty much any animal bigger than this. So of all the other phyla, each individual species of all the other phyla have at least one species of specific roundworm parasite just for themselves. Humans have 5 or 6 roundworm species that are particular just to people, and then another 7 or so that we share with some other animals. I wish I could go through them all. This is my area of research, so I kind of like them. This is a very old designation. The nematodes. Big deal here, we're building, right? Is it still ectoderm and endoderm, still mesoderm, now internal body cavities. Sealed, not just digestive cavities, but body cavities. And that allows, we talked about this, that allows a certain amount of independence of organ, a certain amount of being able to move one thing next to another thing without really messing it up. These guys, incidentally, are interesting. Some of you saw those in the pond tank. About the size of the big single-celled organisms, but complex organisms in and of themselves. Rotifers, small phylum, I'm not going to write it down. There's less than 4,000 species total, but found in virtually all freshwater systems everywhere in the world. So let me write some stuff down. Nematodes, nematoda, roundworms. Now, if you read about this stuff, you'll run into These guys being, their internal space being called a pseudocoelom as opposed to a coelom. A coelom is supposed to be an internal body cavity where the lining is, starts as mesoderm. And these guys, their spaces have endoderm and ectoderm on various sides of them. But the thing is, the mesodermal distinction is fuzzy anyway. And so the coelom, pseudocoelom designation tends to be going out of favor. You'll still see it in some books, but it doesn't really hold up when you really look at the derivation of some of these spaces. So I'm not using it. I'm not doing anything other than mentioning it there. Another big deal here. This will come up when we talk about digestive systems. Entrance and exit in a different place. And we will talk about the strengths of that as opposed to a single opening digestive system, which is what we've had up till now when we get to digestive systems. C. elegans. You can see why they call it C. elegans. This is one of the basic model animals. Fruit flies, mice, C. elegans. These guys have been used for decades because they have that determinate cleavage. Is that they're sort of on the protostome branch, they're down at the bottom of it, sometimes they're on the branch, sometimes they're below the branch. But they do this where very, very early, the cells have their fates set. And because C. elegans is a small worm, unusual for nematodes, it can be both male and female. It has a very quick life cycle of about 2 weeks. It's very easy to keep in the lab. And you can do stuff with it. They've done many, many things with it. They can tell you from the 8-cell stage what each of those 8 cells is going to be in the final worm. And I don't think I wrote the number down. I forget. Every adult C. elegans, and this happens in a bunch of nematodes, I think it's 979 cells. It always has the same number of cells. And so the chemistry, the cellular biology of, okay, this cell is going to be these parts of the body. What genes are being activated? What chemicals are being released? What proteins are being made? What does that do to these cells and to the cells around them? That's all been worked out to a great degree studying these guys. So a tremendous amount of developmental biology can be traced back to C. elegans. And it turns out that we use similar chemicals to build a digestive system as they do. Is that ours activate later, but we basically follow a lot of the same patterns as these guys. Is that our Hox genes are very similar, all that other stuff. There's some indication that roundworm parasites have been classically useful to humans as an immune system trainer. There's an island in the South Pacific that they tracked for about 40 years. And as they got the roundworm parasites under control, allergies, as the roundworm parasites went down, allergies went up. Is that as we took away the immune system's training, it started to respond to things it shouldn't be responding to. It's part of what's called the hygiene hypothesis, where if the kids are raised in too clean an environment, their immune systems don't learn to function properly. But this is a little bit of a part of it you don't hear about very often, where it may take specific types of input in order to train it properly. There's a number of really interesting roundworm parasites that I'm kind of hold myself back. If we had full classes, I'd tell you the stories, and you'd be really queasy when you left the room. But we're just going to move on. Now, this is not a phylum. Remember, connecting organism groups through their embryos. There is, I thought I had a picture of this somewhere on one of these. Well, it'll show up on one of the later ones, I guess. there's 8 or 9 different phyla that go through a larval stage that looks remarkably similar, even though the adults of the phyla don't look anything alike. And that's another one of these embryonic connections that links groups you wouldn't necessarily link just comparing the adults. So this turns out to be an important evolutionary research entry point into connecting things before they started to do a lot of DNA. Okay, this is the next phylum. Mollusks have an external surface called a mantle. In an awful lot of mollusks, it generates a shell. In most mollusks, it folds in and forms a cavity, sometimes an extensive cavity, sometimes a small cavity. And that cavity is used for breathing in some cases, for filter feeding in some cases, for reproduction in some cases, for holding on to offspring in some cases. There's a lot of different, for propulsion in the squids and the octopus, is that its mantle cavity is squeezable and it pushes water out and pushes them along. The middle of the body is where all the guts are. Visceral mass. Viscera are guts, basically. It's a general term for guts. And these guys have a structure known as a foot. And the foot varies from group to group. Snails, pretty obvious. Big old flat bottom of the snails is that it secretes mucus, and the bottom of the snail has cilia. Microscopic. I mean, the mucus gives it something a little bit more substantial to push against the water, but a whole bunch of cilia on the bottom of the snail, not going to move it real fast. But they've got the shell to protect them. Slugs, which have lost the shell, tend to be very bad to eat, tend to be very poisonous, so they don't need the shell. And remember that worm shape. Slugs are more of a worm shape. They can get under things that snails can't easily get into and under. Clams and their relatives, clams and oysters and scallops and mussels and all that, have a single hinged shell around their mantle cavity. And they pull water in, run the water through a very elaborate gill that's a filter, and they're filter feeders, and then the water comes out through another, what's called a siphon. Octopus and squid. Oh, the foot in those guys is something that can stick out of the shell. In its simplest form, it kind of looks like a tongue, and it can be used to push the shell along or to dig for clams. In an octopus, the foot is long tentacles with suckers on them. So lots of variety of shape in the mollusks, but all built on the same basic structural setup. I mentioned this, but I'm going to write it down. We're now going up the one main branch of the protostomes. I don't know how well you're going to be able to see this. This is an old cartoon by the guy who originated The Simpsons, based on what a real animal family tree would look like. And if you've got good enough resolution, you can freeze frame this. There's no way I'm reading all of this. But even 1985, so this is a long, long time ago. Even long ago, you've got radio DJs, Republicans, and lawyers all on the same branch, branched off of roundworms, tapeworms, and bloodsuckers. So, stinging jellyfish going to the police and auto mechanics and meter maids. This guy had some issues, probably still does have some issues. Here, let's put up the real one. So, we've got the sponges, we've got the platyhelminths, we've got the nematodes. See the pseudocoelomates? This is actually not labeled properly. Here's the mollusks on the first branch of the protostomes. Remember I said sometimes these come off below, sometimes these come off at the base of it. These are the annelids. This is not terribly well labeled. That's the next group we're going to talk about. And then everything up here are the arthropods. So this is all one phylum. The deuterostomes is an even simpler group if you look at just the phyla. You've got the echinoderms and the chordates. Is that this whole group is our group. And it's split off into the subgroups. Basic structure of the mollusk. Actually, I like this one better. Visceral mass. This purple thing is the mantle. Here's your mantle cavity. In this case, this would be an aquatic snail, so it's got a gill there. The land snails tend to use this more like it was a lung. There's a single tube, opening here, digestive cavity, so again, that's continuing. And all the other stuff is there. And here's the foot. General body plan of a mollusk. And you can see visceral mass labeled, you can see mantle labeled, you can see the foot labeled. Here it is. Would be if I had it turned around right. Troncophore larva. Looks like a single-celled ciliate, but it's actually got a digestive system already, so it's multi-celled. And you've got your snails and slugs, you've got your cephalopods, which are the squid and the octopus and the cuttlefish. We'll talk about them a little bit more when we talk about animal intelligence. You've got your clams and all their relatives. This is a pretty small group. You've got your nautiluses too that aren't even on here. You've got your chitons. Now the chitons are kind of interesting is that they show hints of what's going to be a big deal for the rest of the groups, almost all the rest of the groups, and that is metamerism, classically called segmentation. Well, let me put this up here. These types of diagrams, the width of these bars, this is through different eras of time. The widths of the bars are supposed to show how many species existed during these times. So this one has dwindled a little bit from, now this is purely based on the fossil record. So, fossil record has humongous sampling errors. So and these, this is a soft-bodied group. It does have, the squid do have an internal shell, and their ancestors had more of that. So you're gonna find more representation in ancient layers than you do in more modern layers. But anyway, so these are the same groups that we were talking about. Some of them are pretty weird. Clam. All right, that's it, Sylvia. Tell the kids their saltwater aquarium's gotta go. When I was first a student at Albany State, they had a big animal room in the basement. Eventually their funding dried up and they don't have that anymore. But, and it was because there was a guy who took care of it. And he had a saltwater aquarium. When you came in the door, the saltwater aquarium was in the back. There was a door out to the greenhouse, and it was just next to the door out to the greenhouse. So from the doorway, you could see the tank. And when this guy came in the door, the octopus he had in that tank would come up to the glass, put its tentacle out of the water, and wave at it. Wouldn't do it with anybody else. As I said, we'll do some talking about their intelligence. This is not true, incidentally, but it's part of the mythology. That story again, well, one stormy night when the whole family was asleep, Your grandfather quietly rose from his bed, took an axe, and made all you little grandkids. You typically can cut an earthworm in half, and if it's healthy, because it's not going to be able to eat for a while and not going to be able to digest properly, it can regenerate the end that you cut off. So the back end can regenerate a front end, the front end can regenerate a back end. Cutting it up into little pieces, you're not going to get a bunch of surviving earthworms from that. But it makes for a good cartoon. These are the annelids. Notice the ridges, Not so much the ridges, a little bit of ridges there. Trochophore larva again. Annelids, classically called the segmented worms. And what used to be called segmentation. That word has been replaced primarily because it does too much double duty. Segmentation can be used for, when your stomach churns, that's called segmentation. There's a whole bunch of ways that the word segmentation gets used. And the biologist wanted something that was specific to what they wanted it to be specific to, and that is metamerism. Easy way to make a large animal. Anterior, posterior. You got stuff that's got to be up front, cephalization and all that. You got stuff that's got to be on the back end of the reproductive system, provisions to try to detect things sneaking up on you that are going to eat you. But in between, you've got to move stuff. You've got to set up a digester, or set up a nervous system, set up a muscle system. And you can do that by just like a train, just doing car after car after car after car after car. And all you really need to do is just like a train has a way for us to walk from front to back. There's connections between the cars. As long as you got the digestive system able to go from the front end to the back end and do its job along the way, you can do a decent sized body just on a basic repetition plan. The segmented worms, the annelids, are the beginnings of that, the simplest of that. Let's see. I've got too many of these overheads. I want to find one that. So going around, in here, there's repetition of the muscle setup. There's repetition of the nerves that make everything work. There's repetition of the circulation system. These guys have internal circulation. But sometimes you get specialization in one part of the animal where most of the pumps are. On some annelids, every segment, every metamere has its own little pump. On some, there's a more dedicated centralized pump. Same thing's true with reproduction. There are very, very few primitive annelids that have reproductive capability on every segment. They've generally combined those somewhere along the middle. But a lot of stuff repeats. Here's the digestive system going through. That's not repeating. So every one of those rings has muscles that go around and muscles that go along. That was a very simple movement system. Very often there are bristles or paddles that stick out the side that can be used to swim, can be used, even earthworm has bristles on the bottom that help it move through a burrow. Peristalsis is the traveling wave of contracting round muscles, circular muscles, helps to move these guys along. And these all repeat. Now, the specialized sensory organs and the central processors for the nervous system tend to be mostly at the front end and some in the back end. And the digestive system doesn't repeat. So, but the branches of the nervous system repeat along the way. Okay, I got a surprise for you. We are metameric animals. We have that same basic build. But here's what happens. Metamerism is not just good for building an animal, it's good for plotting an animal and then messing with it. Is that if you look at our backbones and the way that our nervous system is laid out, if you look at the way that our arteries and veins branch and go to various places, you look at, I mean, there's a reason why you have those washboard abs, you have segmentation in the abs. We are metameric animals, but we basically just use it as a starting plan, and then a lot of it goes away. A lot of it fuses together, which happens in the annelids, in the leeches. The leeches are metameric on the outside, but on the inside they tend to have one big body cavity, and they don't really follow the rule. I have way more overheads for annelids than I realized. There's three main groups to these. There are marine worms that live in the ocean. There's freshwater worms and earthworms. Those are a related group. They're combined, that live in freshwater systems. And the leeches, which are primarily predators. I know you tend to think of them as parasites because that's when we run into them. But they are definitely predators. If you really want to see them in action, I was just yesterday watching, somebody has a film where they have filmed migrating tadpoles. It's a kind of real cool photography. But somewhere along the line, they're showing the things that the tadpoles have to deal with. And they show these leeches grabbing them and eating them. Okay, that's a good place to stop.